Fear has a taste, and it is the taste of your own blood where a ring split your lip against your teeth. Not the clean copper of a cut finger. Something older, something that comes up the back of the throat when a hand you trusted closes into a fist. She ran with that taste in her mouth and a 12-year-old's wrist clamped in her own, up a black grade where the snow started halfway to the sky. And far down in the dark behind her, a dog bayed, and a lantern swung, and a man's voice she had answered to for 2 years called her name the way you call a strayed animal back to a pen. One woman. One girl. 1,000 feet of mountain, and not a soul in it who owed them a thing. She bared her teeth at the timber and decided she would freeze on her feet before she would go back down to him. Then a shadow came out of the trees that was bigger than the trees, and a low voice, scraped raw with cold and disuse, cut across the wind. He won't come past the tree line. The town at the bottom of the mountain was called Cinnabar, and it was less a town than a wound somebody had cut into the side of the Bitterroots and never let heal. A quartz mill ran day and night and shook the floorboards of every false-fronted building on the one rutted street. A freight yard, a timber camp up the near slope, 4 saloons, a mercantile, and a church that doubled as a magistrate's court when the circuit man rode through, and over all of it a permanent rust-colored haze of mill-tailing dust that got into the bread and the bedsheets and the lungs. On the 11th of December, in the year 1881, a woman named Eliza Bram, Eliza Tamlin now, by a paper signed 2 winters back, walked out of a clapboard house at the edge of that town with everything she could carry sewn into a quilt, her younger sister's hand in her fist, and a thin brass wedding band cutting into a finger gone too swollen to take it off. She was 22 years old. She had been a copy clerk in a telegraph office in Helena before her father died, and the money went, fast and sideways, the way money goes when the man who understood it stops breathing. She could add a column of figures in her head faster than most men could with a pencil, and that skill, which had fed her once, was worth precisely nothing on the side of a mountain in December. She had married Royce Tamlin because he ran the freight contract and the timber lease at Cinnabar, and he had stood at her father's grave with his hat in his hands and told her, gently, that a woman alone with a child sister did not last a winter in this country, and that he would see to them both. She believed him for about 4 months. Then the gentleness had gone the way the tailing dust goes, settling into everything until it was just the color of the air. The girl's name was Nell. She was 12, all elbows and knees and a fierce overbite, and eyes that missed nothing, and she had not said a word since they left the house, because Eliza had told her, in the dark, the same 2 words their mother used before a thunderstorm came over the Big Belt Range. Hush now. Nell walked. She carried the smaller bundle, the one with the cornmeal and the lucifer matches and the good wool socks, and she did not cry, and she did not complain, and she did not ask the question sitting behind her teeth, which was whether Royce would catch them, because she had seen what Royce did when he was crossed. She had a long, thin scar inside her own forearm where a stove door had been shut on it for spilling the lamp oil, and she understood the arithmetic of the night better than a child should. It had taken Eliza 2 years to learn to leave. The night he twisted the ring on her finger and told her she was his, that the law said so, and the church said so, and her dead father had as good as handed her over. The morning she found Nell flinching from a raised hand, the way a beaten dog flinches. She added it all up the way she added everything, a long, honest column, and on the 11th of December, when Royce rode up to the high timber lots, she balanced the account. She took $41, she had hidden a coin at a time, inside the hem of her winter cloak. She took the cornmeal. She took her sister. And she walked out the door and turned, not toward the road and the railhead, because the road was the first place he would look, but toward the mountain, because no sane woman ran up a mountain in December, and so it was the one direction he would never believe. She had a map of it in her head, more or less. Everyone in Cinnabar knew about the trapper, the way they knew about the weather, a thing up the mountain, half a rumor, that you respected and did not go near. He came down twice a year with a string of pack mules loaded with marten and fox and wolf, said about 9 words the whole time, and went back up. The men at the freight yard said he had killed 3 men in a single night over a stolen trapline, and had been at Shiloh in the war, and come out of it wrong. Eliza did not care if he was a killer. She cared that he was up the mountain, where Royce was not, and that men who lived alone in the high country knew how to keep a fire and read a storm, and she would need both before morning, or she and Nell would die. They climbed. The grade above Cinnabar went up through the timber lots first, raw stumps and slashed piles under the snow, then into standing lodgepole pine, so thick the day went green and dim, then up toward the place where even the lodgepole gave out, and only the wind-bent white bark and the bare rock remained. The tree line, where the forest stopped because the mountain told it to. For now it was only up, and cold, and the snow getting deeper with every 100 feet, and Nell's breath coming harder, and the light failing the way it fails in the mountains in December, all at once, like a hand over a lamp. By the time the first real dark came down, they were above the heavy timber, both of them soaked to the knee, Eliza carrying the quilt bundle and half of Nell, and she understood with the flat, clear calm that comes when the body stops pretending that they were not going to make it. The cold had stopped hurting, and that was the worst sign of all. When the cold stops hurting, you are already dying. She got Nell down into the lee of a granite shelf, put her own cloak over the both of them, and held her sister against her chest and felt the girl shaking, which was good because shaking meant alive. And then, because there was nothing else to do, and because she had not done it in 2 years, she prayed, not for herself, she was past that, but for the girl, a hard, furious prayer that was mostly just her dead mother's name, said over and over into the wind. The wind took it, the way the wind took everything up there, and then it brought something back. Not an answer, but a smell. Wood smoke and pine pitch and the rank animal stink of green hides, and a shape detached itself from the deeper black of the tree line and came toward them across the snow without hurry, and it was the biggest man Eliza Bram had ever seen. He came down out of the white bark the way weather comes, no sound to him at all in the snow, a fur coat that still wore the shape of the bear it had been, a lever-action rifle in one hand held as casually as another man holds a walking stick, and a beard gone half to ice over a face she could not read in the dark. He crouched in front of them and put 2 bare fingers against Nell's throat, then against Eliza's, reading the pulse in each, the way a man reads sign in mud. Quick, impersonal, certain, and she got one hand up between them with the small, dull glint of her father's pocket-knife in it, 3 inches of cheap steel against a mountain of a man, and he did not look at it at all. "He won't come past the tree line," he said, which made no sense to her then. Then he shrugged out of the bear coat and dropped it over the 2 of them, and the inside of it was warm as a banked stove, and he said one more thing before he gathered Nell up against his chest as if she weighed nothing and jerked his chin at Eliza to follow. "Cabin's close. Walk behind me and step where I step. There's no daylight left to argue in." She did not remember most of the walk. She remembered the bear coat, the size of his back breaking the wind, Nell's pale face slack over his shoulder, and her own terror that slack meant dead until he said, without turning, "She's sleeping. Cold ones cry, quiet ones are warm. Keep up." She remembered the trees thinning and a darker shape against the cliff, the iron weight of a door, a wash of heat off a low fire, and then her knees were gone, and the floor came up, and a hard hand caught the back of her head before it struck the planks. When she woke, it was to pain, which meant she was alive. Her feet had been unwrapped and propped near, never against, she noticed even then, near but not against, the iron stove, and the blood was coming back into them, and it felt like coals shoved under the nails, and she set her jaw and breathed through it and did not make a sound, because a sound was a thing you offered when you wanted help, and she had unlearned the wanting of help a long time ago. She lay on a rope-strung bunk under a weight of furs that smelled of smoke and animal. A fire roared in the squat iron stove, and 3 feet from it, wrapped in a blanket on a pallet, Nell was asleep, her face flushed pink with returned heat, her chest rising and falling, alive. That was the first thing Eliza made herself be certain of. The girl was alive. The man was across the room with his back to her, working at a plank table by the light of a single burning rush dipped in tallow. He did not turn around when her breathing changed, but his shoulders settled in a way that told her he knew she was awake. "Frostnip in your two smallest toes, on the left and the side of the right heel," he said, to the wall, flat as a man reading off a tally sheet. "Not deep. You kept moving, that's what saved you. They'll burn for a few days and the skin'll come off, but you'll keep them all." A pause, the small, steady rasp of a blade on a stone. "The girl's better off than you are. She was inside your coat for the last of it. That was the right thing to do." And Eliza, who had been bracing for 2 years for every sentence a man might say to her, did not know what to do with a man who saved your life and your sister's life, and then handed it to you like a frostbite report. So she reached for the only language she had ever been able to trust. "What do I owe you?" she said, her voice a cracked whisper. "For the fire, for the room, I have money. Not much, but I pay what I owe. I won't be beholden." For the first time, he turned around. The firelight caught a long, pale scar that ran from his hairline down through one eyebrow to the cheekbone, a face weathered to the color of saddle leather, and eyes the flat gray of the sky an hour before it snows. She braced, chin down, both hands gone still and deliberate on the furs, the way she held still inside herself before Royce's hand came down. His jaw worked once before the words came, the way a frozen hinge moves before it gives. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "There's no account up here. I don't keep one." He looked then at her left hand, where the thin brass band cut into the swollen finger. "And whatever that ring's got you used to, that's down the mountain. It doesn't reach up here." Then he turned back to his stone, and as far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. His name was Silas Crane. She learned it the way she learned everything that first sealed-in week, in single hard words, dug out of a silence that filled the cabin the way water fills a well, slowly and to the top. He was 39 and had come up this mountain 9 winters back and gone down it only for powder and lead and flour and coffee since. He trapped marten and fox and wolf, packed the pelts twice a year to the traders at Fort Benton, and came back with a small, heavy poke of gold dust he kept in a tin behind a loose stone in the chimney, and had no use for at all. He had been a soldier. She learned that not from any word, but from the way he came up off his pallet the second night when the goat kicked a bucket onto the balls of his feet with a knife already in his hand, and his face gone to a flat killing nothing before his eyes were open, and the long minute it took him to come back from wherever the sound had thrown him. He gave Eliza the bunk, and Nell the warm pallet by the stove, and on the first true night of the storm, when the cold outside dropped to a place where water thrown from a cup froze before it hit the snow, Silas Crane took 2 hides and went out to sleep in the lean-to with the goat. She lay awake that whole first night and listened to the storm try the door and did not understand him. The one fixed law of her life, the law Royce had taught her with the ring and the boot, the law the whole town of Cinnabar lived by, was that nothing came free, that a roof had a price, and the price, in the end, was always her. And the man had gone out to sleep with a goat in air that could kill him, rather than spend one night under his own roof with a woman who might think she owed him for it. She did not trust it. She had her father's pocket-knife, and the second day, while he ran his trap-line, she sharpened it on his own stone and hid it up her sleeve against her wrist, and kept it there for 3 weeks. Not because she had caught him at anything, because in 22 years she had never once met a kindness that did not turn out to be a lien. The storm held them sealed in for 4 days, and the cabin was one room 12 feet by 15, with a man and a woman and a child, and a fire that had to be fed all through the dark, and the only thing to do was learn to live inside those walls without touching. Silas showed her the place without ever once calling it rules. Break the skin of ice on the water bucket before you drink. Feed the stove with the small split first and then the rounds, and never let it die down to coals after dark. The girl slept 3 feet from the stove, because that was warm enough, and no warmer. He was particular about the distance in a way Eliza did not understand until much later, and he did not look at her when she had to wash or change Nell's wet stockings. He turned to the wall and became deeply occupied with his own work, and there was nothing performed about it, no show of manners. It was the plain habit of a man who had decided a long time ago, out where no one was watching, exactly what kind of man he was going to be. It was Nell who breached him first, because children breach what grown people cannot. On the third day, the girl crept to the table where Silas was repairing the jawspring of a trap, and with her sharp, missing-nothing eyes, asked him, the first words she had spoken since the house, how it worked. And Silas Crane, who had said maybe 40 words to Eliza in 3 days, looked at the girl a long moment, and then he showed her. The spring, the pan, the jaws, how the dog held the whole thing cocked, and let her press it down with both her small hands until it set, and something in his weathered face moved that Eliza had not seen there before. After that, he gave Nell real things to do, not made-up tasks to keep a child quiet. She learned to skin a marten without nicking the hide, her small fingers better at the close work than his big scarred ones, to render fat into tallow and dip the rushes, to keep the firewood count, chalking a mark on the wall for every round burned, and Silas treated the count as a serious matter, because for a child to be useful is to be safe, and he knew it. By the 5th day, Nell had stopped flinching at sudden movements, a thing Eliza had not been able to give her in 2 years. Eliza tried, the 4th day, to pay. His bear coat hung by the door with a long split-up one-shoulder seam where the stitching had rotted, and she had her sewing things in the quilt bundle, needles, waxed linen thread, her mother's thimble worn to a silver shine, and she sat by the stove and mended the seam with the small even stitches that had once filled a dressmaker's order book back in Helena, stronger than new. When Silas came in, stamping snow, and found her finishing it, he went very still, and his jaw worked, and she thought she had trespassed on the one thing a man alone keeps wholly his own. Then he took the coat and turned it to the firelight and ran his rough thumb down the row of stitches, the way another man runs his thumb down a column of figures. "That's tighter than it came from the maker," he said, the nearest thing to wonder she had yet heard from him. "It's toward the room," she said, "toward what I owe." And the wonder went out of his face like a snuffed rush, and the flat gray came down. "Stop that," he said. "Stop trying to settle up with me. There's no ledger up here, and I won't be turned into one. You sewed a coat because the coat was torn. That's all that happened. When a person makes every kindness into a debt, all she's doing is teaching herself nobody ever does a thing for free. And I'm too old and it's too cold to spend a whole winter being your proof of that." Then he went back out into the wind to look at a trap he had already looked at, because he needed to not be in the room. On the 5th morning the storm broke, and a sun came up over the saw-toothed ridge, so bright on the new snow that it was a pain to look at, and the world outside the iron door was a hard blue and white nothing that ran out to the curve of the earth. The pass was closed. He told her so plainly. The drifts in the cuts of the grade were over a tall man's head, and nothing would move up or down that mountain until the Chinook came in April and ate the snow off the south slopes. Better than 3 months off. Then he handed her a tin cup of black coffee and a pair of his own wool socks, vast on her ruined feet, and went to skin the fox he had brought in frozen. And that was the whole of the announcement, that she and her sister would be living in this man's one room until the snow that had nearly killed them finally let them go. So began the long arithmetic of the winter, the only kind of counting Eliza Bram had ever fully trusted. The cord of firewood divided by the days, the sack of flour divided by the weeks, the cold subtracted from the dark hours and added back at first light. On the 6th day, she watched Silas split wood and saw the rick by the door was lower than 3 months would need, and she said so because numbers were the one place her voice did not shake. He looked at the rick and then at her. "You can figure," he said, not a question. He handed her the splitting maul the next morning, and her copy clerk's hands, soft from paper and thread, came apart on the helve in 3 days. Blisters, then broken blisters, then the slow building of something harder. And he did not coddle them, and he did not stop her, because he had heard the thing underneath her counting, the same thing she had heard nowhere else her whole life. The refusal to be carried. She learned to split wood and to set a snare on the snowshoe hair runs at the timber's edge. And on the 8th day, Silas took her out on the trapline for the first time, the two of them breaking trail on the wide woven snowshoes through a world gone silent and blue under the snow-laden pines, and he showed her how to read the country, which way a marten runs, where a fox crosses, how to find the line of blazed trees that marked the way home when the snow had swallowed everything else. And up where the heavy timber gave out into wind-twisted white bark and then bare rock, he stopped at the very last of the trees and put his bare hand flat against the trunk of a gnarled old white bark pine and said the strangest thing he had yet said to her. "This is the Treeline," he said, as if it were a name and not just a fact. "Above this, nothing grows that the wind doesn't allow. There's a line like that in most things, a place where what's below can't follow." He looked at her left hand, where the brass band still cut into the finger. "You crossed yours coming up. He just doesn't know it yet." And he turned and started back down, and she stood a moment with her hand where his had been on the cold bark, and she did not understand it, and would not, until the day Royce Tamlin stood 100 feet below that very tree and learned he could not come any higher. Nell named the goat. On the 9th day, fetching the milk in the blue dark, she had been butted in the hip by its hard, flat skull and looked at by its long, solemn, yellow-eyed face, and she had laughed, a real laugh, the first one Eliza had heard from her sister in longer than she wanted to count, and named the creature Bishop, because, she said, it had a face like it was about to scold somebody for dancing. And Silas, expecting to be told a goat was milk and meat and not a thing you named, only tried the word, Bishop, and after a moment said, "He's got the face for it," and went on with his work. And Eliza understood that her sister, at least, had been let all the way inside, past the door, into the part of the cabin that was a home. The wariness broke on the 11th day, and it broke, the way these things do, not over something large but over the smallest thing in the cabin. Eliza had finally gotten the ring off. The swelling in her hands had gone down with rest and warmth, and one night by the stove she worked the thin brass band over the knuckle at last and held it in her palm. The wedding ring Royce Tamlin had put on her and twisted and used as a deed of ownership for 2 years, and did not know what to do with it. She could not wear it. She could not, somehow, throw it in the stove, though she wanted to. A lifetime of poverty does not let you burn money even when the money is a brand. So she set it on the shelf by the door, a small, cheap, dull circle of brass, to decide about later, and Silas, coming in that night, saw it on the shelf, and saw her bare, reddened hand, and he stopped, and his jaw worked, and he said, very low, not looking at her, "You got it off." And Eliza heard, underneath the 3 flat words, the whole of what he could not say, that he had seen the ring cutting into her finger since the snow, had known exactly what it was and what it meant, and said nothing and waited, because the one thing he would not do was reach for her hand uninvited, even to take off a thing that was hurting her. And something in Eliza Bram, that had been braced for 2 years, came loose. She told him that night. She had not meant to. But the wall between them had cracked like the ice on the bucket, and what came through it was words. Royce, and the ring, and the boot through her mother's chair, and the stove door on Nell's arm, and the long, slow arithmetic of learning to leave. She told it flatly, because she would have broken if she had let any feeling into it, and Silas Crane sat across the stove and listened, and did not interrupt, and did not make a single sound of pity, which she could not have borne, and when she was done, he was quiet a long time. Then he said, looking into the fire and not at her, "I had a wife, up here, 8 winters back, and a boy, not 2 years old." The fire popped. His jaw worked. Lung fever came up this mountain the way the snow comes up it, and I rode 2 days down to the gulch for a doctor and came back too late, and buried the both of them out back under that flat stone you'll have seen, and stayed to keep the grave company because I could not think where else in the world to be. The worst part of it, he said, and this was the only time in the whole of that winter his voice cracked. "Is that when you finally scream up here? The only thing that hears you is the trees." And Eliza Bram, who had screamed into a blizzard with nothing but her dead mother's name in it, and been heard, after all, by a shape that came out of the tree line. Eliza set down the sock she was darning and crossed the 10 feet of plank floor and sat down on the bench beside him, not touching, just there, and let the man hear, for once, another living thing that was not the trees. Neither of them said the thing that was happening, because to say it would have been to make a kind of paper out of it, and they had both had enough of paper to last a life. It was Nell who broke the last of the distance between them, and she did it the way the smallest one always does, by nearly dying. It came on in the dead black middle of January, with a storm walking over the roof that had not let up in 2 days. Eliza woke in the night to a sound that turned the marrow of her bones to slush. Nell not crying but laboring, each small breath a wet, rattling drag, like a chain pulled through gravel. She had the girl up off the pallet and against her in an instant, and felt the heat pouring off her, a furnace where a child should be only warm, and she knew, with the flat, clear calm that had never once lied to her, that this was the lung fever, the same drowning sickness she had heard the doctor name over other people's dead, the thing that took the young fastest of all. And before the fear could close her throat all the way, Silas Crane was up off his pallet and across the room, and his big flat hand was against Nell's chest, reading the rattle through his palm. He did not panic. The man who could not sleep in a closed room with another man breathing was, in the face of a sick child, the steadiest thing in the cabin. He had buried this exact night 8 winters back, and spent every winter since learning everything the doctor had told him too late, and now it came out of him in a flat, fast stream while his hands never stopped moving. Lung fever. It settles in the small tubes and swells them shut, and she can't clear them. We open them with steam, thin the blood with bark, keep her sitting up so the wet doesn't drown her lying flat. Hang that elk hide off the bunk rail. Now. Eliza moved. He shaved a fist of bark off a length of dried willow he kept in the rafters, and set it steeping, packed the iron pot with snow, and got it boiling and dropped in a fistful of dark, sticky eucalyptus leaves from a paper twist in a tin. "The Cheyenne taught me the willow for the fever," he said to her unasked question. "The traders carry the leaf down from the coast. It opens the lungs." They built a tent of the elk hide over a frame of split staves beside the roaring stove, so the steam pooled thick and resinous and hot in a space no bigger than a coffin, and into it Eliza crawled with her sister held upright against her shoulder, and breathed the steam with her, and dripped the bitter willow bark tea between the girl's cracked lips, a drop at a time off the corner of a clean rag, hour after hour, while on the other side of the hide Silas kept the pot boiling and the fire roaring the whole long night, and did not sleep. The fever climbed past the place where it kills. In the blackest hour, the hour that has no number, Nell went slack against her sister's shoulder, and her breath grew shallow and far apart, and Eliza felt the girl beginning to slip the way she had felt her own feet slip away in the snow, the body going quiet, deciding. And she could not get the warmth into her fast enough. Her own arms were not enough. She was not a furnace. She was a frightened woman in a steam tent in the dark, losing the last of her own blood in all the world. And she said his name, not Nell's. His. Silas, broken, the way you say a name when it is the only prayer you have left. He came into the tent and did the thing he had not done once in all the days they had been sealed in together. He pulled off his shirt and took the small, burning body of the girl into his own bare, scarred arms, and laid her against the slow, strong drum of his living heart, and pulled Eliza in against the both of them, so the 3 of them were sealed together inside the hide and the steam. Skin to skin in the dark, the girl's flickering small life pressed between 2 grown bodies that had nothing left to give her but their own heat and their own breath. And Silas Crane, who had buried a wife and a son on this mountain and never wept that anyone living had seen, began to talk, low, steady, into the girl's wet hair. Not prayers, but the country. A creek east of here that ran open all winter, a fox den in the rocks above the high trap with kits every spring, a meadow up the back of the cliff that went blue with camas flowers in June, so thick it looked like a lake fell out of the sky. "You haven't seen the commas, Nell. You have to stay for the commas." Holding a dying child in the world by promising her the world. And Eliza, her arms around the both of them, and her face against the man's bare shoulder, and the steam scalding her lungs, felt the thing she had no name for finally find its name. And the name was not toll, and it was not debt, and it was not even, yet, love. The name was home. Somewhere in the dark she had stopped bracing, and the price had not come. The fever broke at first light. She felt it go. Felt the girl go slack in a different way, a sleeping way and not a dying way. Felt the rattling breath ease into the deep clean, even so, of a child who has come back. She got her face up off Silas's shoulder and looked, and the blue was gone from around Nell's lips, her thin chest rising and falling slow and clean, and Eliza made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. And Silas Crane, holding the sleeping girl against his bare chest in the first gray light, looked down at her with 8 winters of grief breaking up behind his eyes like river ice in a thaw, and his jaw worked, and he said, very low, "There she is," as if he had been standing at the door of the world to see who came back through it. And Eliza understood, watching him, that the breaking of the fever had balanced some column she had not let herself add before. She did not want the road down the mountain, or the clean, rented room with the lock only she held the key to. She wanted to see the commas come up blue in June with these two, in this cabin with the mountain for its back wall. The wanting was so large and so unfamiliar, it frightened her worse than the fever had, because she had spent her whole life learning that to want a thing was the surest way to have it taken. She did not yet know how right she was, because down in Cinnabar, while the snow walked over the cabin and a fever broke and a woman learned the shape of a home, Royce Tamlin had not stopped looking for his wife. A man like Royce did not lose a thing he considered his, and simply let it go. He rode to the railhead first and came up empty. It took him the better part of 2 months and a loosened tongue at the mercantile, a clerk who remembered the trapper's twice-a-year trade, a freight hand who had seen a woman and a girl take the high grade out of town the day Tamlin rode to the timber lots, to put it together. And when he had, Royce did not come up the mountain in a rage, which would have been survivable. He went to the magistrate. The Chinook came in the 2nd week of April, all at once, the way it does in the high country, a warm wind out of the southwest that ate 3 feet of snow off the south slopes in 2 days, turned the dooryard to mud, woke the creek under the ice to a roar, and opened the grade. Eliza marked the thaw with the same dread she had once felt watching the pass close with relief. An open road runs 2 ways. She did not say so. She and Silas had not said any of it aloud. They had only, since the night of the fever, begun to sit closer by the stove, and once she had woken in the gray to find a fold of his own blanket laid over her, where it had slipped in the night, which meant he had crossed the cold room in the dark to do it, and crossed back, and those were the only papers either of them had signed. Nell could run the trapline now nearly as well as her sister. The 3 of them had become, without anyone saying the word, a household. They were 4 days into the thaw when Bishop the goat went stiff-legged in the lean-to and stared down the bare mud grade and would not be milked, and Silas Crane came up off the chopping block in one motion with that flat killing gray coming down over his face, and went into the cabin and took the lever-action rifle down off its pegs and worked the action once to seat a cartridge, and said, without turning around, "Riders, coming up slow, more than 2. Eliza's hands went still and deliberate at her sides, the loom steadiness, the bracing. "Royce," she said. It was not a question. She knew the riders the way Silas knew them, in the body, before the mind had words. "He waited out my whole marriage to own me. He'd come the first day the grade let a horse up." Silas looked at her, and at Nell standing white in the cabin door, and at the open grade below the tree line. "How many will he bring?" he asked, "to take 1 woman and a girl off 1 trapper?" And Eliza, who knew exactly the kind of coward Royce was under the freight contract and the soft explaining voice, said, "All he can hire. He won't come up here unless he's certain he can't lose. And he'll have paper. Royce always brings paper. It's the only kind of fighting he's brave enough for. They came up the grade an hour later, 4 men on horseback picking through the mud and the rotten snow, and they stopped, the way Silas had known they would, not in the open below the cabin, but down at the lower edge of the heavy timber, 100 feet below the last of the trees, below the tree line. The man in front held up both empty hands to show he wanted to talk first, which was the most dangerous thing about him. Royce Tamlin sat a tall bay horse in a good wool coat, soft, pale, and clean-shaven, and reasonable. Beside him rode a lean, sour man with a tin star pinned to his vest and an oilskin packet across his saddlebow. Deputy Sloan, sworn in by the bought magistrate at Cinnabar, who smoothed the packet flat against his thigh and touched the star before he said a word, as though the badge did his thinking for him. Behind them sat 2 hired men with rifles across their saddlebows and the flat, dead eyes of men paid by the day to do what they are told and not ask why. A big mill hand named Burke with a jaw like a stone, and a lank tobacco-chewing drifter Eliza did not know. 4 guns to take 1 woman and a girl off 1 trapper. Exactly as she had said. Silas Crane stepped out of the cabin and walked down through the mud and the last of the snow, unhurried, the rifle held low and easy across his body, and he walked until he was standing in the open at the very top of the heavy timber, at the tree line beside the gnarled old white bark pine where he had put his hand 2 months before, and he stopped there, square in the only path up, and looked down the 100 feet of open ground at the 4 mounted men, with that flat gray nothing in his weathered face. He did not raise his voice. In the still thin mountain air after a storm, a low voice carries better than a shout. "That's far enough," he said. "Mr. Crane, is it?" Royce called up, pleasant as a man at a church supper. "I've heard of you. I've come a long way, and I'd as soon do this without trouble. That woman behind you is my lawful wife. The girl's my lawful ward by the same paper, her nearest guardian since their father passed. I've brought the law along to keep it orderly." He nodded at the deputy. Sloan cleared his throat and held up the oilskin packet and read, in the flat, droning voice of a man reading a thing he has been paid not to think too hard about, that he held a lawful writ sworn before the territorial magistrate, commanding the return of one Eliza Tamlin, wife, to the person of her husband, Royce Tamlin, and likewise the minor Nell Bram, to his guardianship in the place of her deceased father, and warning that any person interfering with the writ would be guilty of obstruction. Paper for the wife, paper for the girl. Royce Tamlin had brought, exactly as Eliza had said, the only weapons he had the stomach to use. A writ, a marriage, 4 guns to enforce them, and the law itself dressed up to do his wanting for him. "It's all in order," Royce called, smiling. "Send them down, Crane, and there needn't be any unpleasantness. I'm a reasonable man. I only want back what's mine." And Silas Crane stood at the tree line, with the old white bark pine at his shoulder and the rifle low across his body, and let the word hang in the cold air a moment before he answered it. "Mine," he said, and there was something terrible in how quiet it was. "I've heard that word from better men than you, and it was a lie in their mouths too. You don't own a woman because a circuit man wrote it down. You don't own a child because you outlived her father. That paper says you do. The paper's wrong, and I've burned wronger paper than that to start a morning fire." He shifted his weight, the smallest motion, and every hired man's eyes dropped to the rifle. "This is the tree line. Below it is your country, your magistrate, your writ, your money, your town that does what you tell it. Above it is mine, and nothing from down there comes up past this tree without my say. Not you, not your paper, not your hired guns." He looked, for just a second, past Royce to the 2 flat-eyed men behind him. "You boys are drawing day wages. Ask yourselves what day wages are worth to a dead man. He can hire more of you, but not up here." His voice did not rise. "Turn around and take your bought deputy and your writ back down my mountain, and you'll all see the bottom of it alive. Or come the last 100 feet, and you'll learn the thing every man learns up here in the end. When you finally scream, the only thing that hears you is the trees. It might have ended there. With another man, it would have. But Royce Tamlin had brought 4 guns precisely so that he would never have to be the brave one. And behind the cover of numbers, even a coward finds a kind of borrowed nerve. And Deputy Sloan, who had been paid and had a tin star to hide behind, said the words that turned a standoff into a killing. "He's obstructing a lawful writ," Sloan said, and touched the star. "Take them." And the big mill hand Burke, who did what he was told and did not ask why, swung his rifle up off the saddle bow. He was fast. Silas Crane was faster and worse, and entirely without anger. The lever action came up and spoke once, and Burke went off the back of his horse into the mud with the surprise still on his stone face, and the whole stand of timber came apart into noise. Silas moved the way Eliza had only ever seen him move in the half-second of waking. Low, fast, no wasted motion, the cold mechanical focus of a wolf in a pen full of calves. And he was in among the trees before the others had found him, using the lodgepole trunks for cover the way the hired men did not know how to. And the lank drifter fired twice into the timber at a shape that was no longer there and went down hard as Silas came around the far side of a deadfall. But the deputy had not been paid to be a fool. Sloan had gotten off his horse and put it between himself and the trees, and as Silas turned, the deputy fired across his own saddle, and Silas Crane grunted and spun and went down behind a fallen log with a red bloom spreading high on his left side, the rifle skidding out of his grip into the wet snow 3 feet beyond his reach. And Eliza Bram, up at the cabin with Nell's hand locked in hers, saw the whole shape of how it was going to end. The man down and bleeding, the rifle out of his hand, 2 guns still up, the deputy and Royce, and a writ that said her sister and her own body belonged to the man who had put a boot through her mother's chair, and something in Eliza Bram that had been bracing her whole life stopped bracing and started aiming. She had watched Silas load that rifle and check it and clean it all winter long, and once, in the dark, she had asked him how it worked, and he had shown her, never thinking it would come to this. She let go of Nell's hand. "Stay," she said, the one word, and Nell, who understood the arithmetic of a bad night better than any child should, stayed. And she went down the muddy slope toward the tree line low and fast, the way she had watched Silas cross a room, and she did not run for the cover of the cabin and the locked door behind her. She ran for the rifle in the snow. Her hands, when they closed on the cold, wet wood of it, her hands were not shaking. They had shaken at the shelf with the brass ring in her palm. They did not shake now. They had gone still and deliberate, the loom steadiness, the column balanced at last, and she brought the lever action up to her shoulder, the way Silas had shown her, and put the brass bead of the front sight on the chest of Deputy Sloan, who was stepping out from behind his horse to finish the man on the ground, and worked the lever, smooth, and fired. The deputy sat down in the mud against the legs of his own horse, and the tin star caught the thin spring light, and he did not get up. Eliza worked the lever again. The spent brass spun gold in the cold sun, and swung the muzzle, smooth, unhurried, onto Royce Tamlin, who had sat his tall bay through the whole of it, expecting numbers and paper and other men's hands to do his work for him. And Royce looked down the 100 feet at his wife, his property, the woman he had twisted a ring onto and explained things to in his soft, reasonable voice, standing at the edge of the timber with a rifle leveled steady at his chest and his 2 hired men face down in the mud, and the deputy dead against a horse's legs, and the soft, pale, reasonable face came all the way apart. He did not even reach for his own gun. He came down off the bay on the wrong side, clumsy, his good wool coat dragging in the mud, and got down on his knees in the rotten snow with his clean, soft hands up in front of his face, the hands that had closed into fists, the hands that had shut a stove door on a child's arm. And he began, this man who had owned a freight contract and a timber lease and the magistrate himself, to beg. "Now wait," he said. "Liza, now wait. You're my wife. That don't change, but we can talk about it. I'll tear up the paper. And the lank drifter, not dead after all, but lying in the snow with a smashed shoulder, lay very still and put both his empty hands flat on the ground where they could be seen, doing the only arithmetic he had left, that no day wage on earth was worth the last 100 feet of that mountain. Silas Crane got up off the ground the hard way, one-handed, his left arm hanging useless, and the red soaking down his side, and came out of the trees and down to where Eliza stood at the tree line, with the rifle still steady on her kneeling husband, and he put his good hand over the barrel and pressed it gently down toward the ground, gently, the way he did every single thing that mattered, and took the rifle from her steady hands. And he stood over the kneeling man, swaying, white under the dirt, and looked down at Royce Tamlin, begging in the mud with his soft hands over his face, and Eliza watched him decide whether to end it. She did not look away. But Silas Crane had buried enough on this mountain, and he was not, in the end, the thing the war had tried to make him. He reached down and took the oilskin packet out of the mud where the dead deputy had dropped it. The writ, the marriage paper, all of Royce Tamlin's law. And he tore it, one-handed, slow, the blood running off his fingers onto the pages, the writ in half, the halves to quarters, the quarters to pieces too small to read, and let the warm Chinook wind scatter the shreds down the wet grade toward the town that had written them. "There's your writ," he said. "There's your marriage. There's your guardianship. The girl's got a sister, the woman's got a home." He set his boot, almost gently, against Royce Tamlin's shoulder and pushed, and the man sat down in the mud. "Cross this line again. Send a man, send 100, send a paper, and I'll bury whoever carries it out back with the others, and the only thing that'll ever hear him is the trees. Now get off my mountain." And Royce Tamlin got up out of the mud and got on his bay the wrong way twice before he made the saddle, and he and the lank drifter, who got up holding his ruined shoulder and did not once look at the bodies of the men who had not been cowards enough to live, turned down the open grade and went down the mountain and out of Eliza Bram's life forever. She got Silas inside. The rifle ball had gone in high on the left side, below the collarbone, and out the back, missing the lung and the bone both, a clean, two-sided hole that would not stop bleeding. And a man had died on this mountain once before, because the nearest doctor was 2 days' hard ride down a thawing grade. So Eliza Bram did the thing her hands had been training for her whole life, without either of them knowing it. She sent Nell for the willow bark and the boiling water. She washed the wound front and back with the last of his trade whiskey. She threaded a curved needle from his own kit with the same waxed linen thread she had mended his coat with, and set her jaw, and her hands went still and deliberate, the loom steadiness, and she sewed Silas Crane shut, front and back. Small, even stitches, tighter than any doctor would have set them, the one skill from her old life that had never failed her, now keeping a man in the world the way his steam tent and his bitter tea and his bare chest had kept her sister in it. He bore it without a sound, watching her face the whole time, and when she had tied off the last stitch and bitten the thread, he said, "Lo, that's tighter than the maker would have put it." The same words he had said about his coat, and she understood it was the highest thing he knew how to say, and she laughed, wet and shaking, and pressed her forehead to his good shoulder, and stayed there. She nursed him through the wound fever that came after, 3 hard days of it, her turn now to keep the pot boiling and the names of the country coming. And on the worst night she did for him what he had done for Nell, and held him through the shaking, no paper between them, and no debt, and no toll. When the fever left him, and he opened the flat gray eyes clear and found her there, neither of them reached for a word like oe or ode, because there were no more accounts between them to keep. He was up and moving inside a week, stiff and one-armed and impossible to keep still, and the high country came on towards summer. And on a warm morning in the last of April, Silas Crane did the thing his whole hard moral law had been building toward, the thing that cost him more than the rifle ball had. He went to the chimney and pried out the loose stone and took out the tin, the poke of gold dust the size of 2 fists, more money than Eliza had seen in her life, and put it in her hands. "The grade's open," he said. "It runs down to Cinnabar and out to the railhead and on to anywhere you had in mind the day you came up this mountain. There's dust here to set you and the girl up clean and free and beholden to nobody ever again. A room with a lock only you hold the key to. I'll break trail for you far as the lower timber." His jaw worked. "And I won't ask you to stay. A man who asks you to stay after the winter you've had is just one more man putting his hand on you. So I'm not asking. I'm handing you the road and the means to take it, and the choice, all of it yours, the way it should have been your whole life." And he set the gold in her 2 hands and stepped back and gave her the one thing no one had given her in 22 years, a choice wholly and only her own, with nothing owed and no one to please and no price waiting at the end of it. Eliza Bram stood in the cabin with a fortune in her hands and looked at the open door and the bright wet grade running down toward the whole wide world she had spent her life trying to reach, and then she looked at the man who had handed it to her, white still, one-armed, stitched shut by her own hand, asking nothing, and she did the arithmetic one last time, the long, honest column she had kept her whole life, and it came out the way it had come out the dawn. The fever broke. The road was only a thing that ran 2 ways, and everything she wanted in the world was on this end of it. She crossed the room. She knelt at the hearth, where she had once set down the thing she could not decide about, and this time her hands were not shaking. She pried up the loose floor plank by the chimney with her father's pocket knife, the knife she no longer carried up her sleeve, and set the poke of gold dust down into the cold, dark earth beneath the floor of the home she was choosing, not throwing the freedom away, keeping it, safe under her own floor where only she knew it lay, against any winter that might come, but refusing, finally and forever, to spend it on leaving. And then she went to the shelf by the door and took down the thin brass wedding band, the ring Royce Tamlin had twisted onto her finger and used for 2 years as a deed, the ring she had not been able to throw in the stove and had not been able to wear, and she carried it back to the open plank and set it down into the dark on top of the gold. "There," she said, "he can keep his paper. I'll keep what it bought, and it bought nothing." And she fit the plank back down over the both of them, the fortune and the brand, and stood up. But Silas Crane took the ring back up. He pried the plank loose again with his one good hand, left the gold where she had buried it, lifted out the thin brass band, and carried it across the room to the stove. And Eliza thought he meant to throw it in the fire after all, and found she did not want him to. But Silas did not throw it in the fire. He took a length of fine snare wire off his bench, and with his one good hand and his teeth, he worked the soft brass ring out into a small open hook, a thing with a use, and hung it on the wall in the warmest corner of the cabin where the firelight could reach it, and on it he hung the cup that Nell drank her morning milk from. "There," he said. "Now it holds something up instead of holding somebody down." Nell came in from the lean-to with the milk and saw it and understood, the way she understood everything, and hung the cup on it herself. The stove ticked. "Leave it where we can see it," Silas said, "so we don't forget what it was, or what it is now." And then he said the only vow either of them ever made, no church and no magistrate, and no circuit man and no paper, his good hand coming to rest on her shoulder, steady, the way she steadied a thread. "You're not anybody's, you never were, you're home." And Eliza Bram, 22 years old, a telegraph clerk and a dressmaker, and a thing that had been married off and branded with a thin brass ring, who had run up a mountain in December with her sister's hand in her fist sooner than be owned one more day, stood in a one-room cabin with the mountain for its back wall and a sleeping fortune under her floor, and a child's cup hanging from her wedding ring on the wall, and a man's steady hand on her shoulder, and she chose with both hands and her whole heart and nothing owed to stay. The commas came up blue in the meadow up the back of the cliff that June, thick as a lake fallen out of the sky, exactly the way he had promised it to a dying child in the dark. Nell saw it. They all three did. And down at the tree line, the gnarled old white bark put out its new green at the very top of the world, the last living thing the wind would allow, marking the line the country below could not cross, and never did again. That was tonight's story from Timberline Hearts. A man down in the town owned a paper that said a woman was his, and a silent man up the mountain spent one whole winter proving that some things were never for sale, could not be bought, and would not be taken. She fled up the mountain from her husband, and the mountain man met them at the tree line with his rifle. And then he spent the cold months teaching her the difference between being sheltered and being owned, which is the whole difference in the world. So tell me, down in the comments, when those riders stopped below the tree line, would you have stayed by the warm stove with the girl, or come down the slope for the rifle in the snow? I think I know which kind of woman Eliza turned out to be. The cold is cruel up here, but the bond is unbreakable. Keep the stove hot. Leave one thing hanging where you can see it so you never forget what you came through. And I'll see you up the pass next week.